Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chloe T. Hammonds, and I'm the Creative Director of Emancipation Arts. And this is day 2 of the 25th Annual Emancipation Marathon. The Emancipation Marathon is a commemoration through literature of enslaved Africans in America. And today, my guests will be Matthew Aguilar and Mike Pfister and Floyd Galloway. And they will each be reading a historical aspect that's not given a lot of attention. We recently celebrated Juneteenth. A lot of people did. But unfortunately, that celebration is a little bit hollow because there are many aspects of it that do not ring true. Not everybody was free in 1865. So I'm going to start out with Matthew, and here we go.
Thank you, Clotie. This comes from the desk of Chief Gary Batten of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, addressed to Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. Dear Madam Speaker, on behalf of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, I write to ask you to exercise your leadership to oppose recent efforts by the chairwoman of the Committee on Financial Services, the Honorable Maxine Waters, to insert in House-related bills being shaped by the House in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, a provision requiring the Choctaw Nation to pay the price of resolving the federal government's freedmen issue. The freedmen issue is a problem caused by the United States, not the Choctaw Nation. Congress should not be permitted to abuse its power by forcing the Choctaw Nation to fix America's longstanding problems of systemic racism rooted in America's enslavement of African Americans. Just as African Americans today struggle to survive and thrive after generations of slavery dispossessed them of the fruits of the labor stolen from their ancestors, so too the Choctaw Nation today struggles to survive and thrive after repeated and massive American thefts of Choctaw land dispossessed the Choctaw Nation of the fruits of the natural resources stolen from the Choctaw Nation. Today, it should shock the American conscience that Chairwoman Waters is asking Congress to force the Choctaw Nation to bear the heavy burden of repairing America's breach with African Americans. America should solve its own problems. Choctaw Nation representatives have tried without success to dissuade Chairwoman Waters to abandon her proposed bill language. We oppose it because it purports to override the federally approved Constitution of the Choctaw Nation, subjugate the sovereignty, self-governance, and self-determination of the Choctaw Nation to the control of the federal government, and bypass tribal and federal judicial procedures. There is no more fundamental element of tribal self-governance than the authority of a tribe like the Choctaw Nation to determine our own citizenship. See Santa Clara Pueblo versus Martinez. See also Rice versus Cayetano. Plains Commerce Bank versus Long Family Land and Cattle Co. As part of their residual sovereignty, tribes retain power to determine tribal membership. Nevada v. Hicks. Indian tribes retain their inherent power to determine tribal membership. Our Choctaw Constitution, adopted by the Choctaw citizens and subsequently approved by the United States government in 1983, requires every applicant for tribal citizenship to show direct lineal descendancy to a Choctaw citizen of Choctaw blood on the 1906 Choctaw Citizen Roll. The Choctaw Nation could not comply with Chairwoman Waters' bill language without violating the Choctaw Constitution. The history of relations between the United States and the Choctaw Nation endured many twists and turns from the early 19th century through the mid-20th century. Many of the dozens upon dozens of treaties and agreements and policies over this 150-year period reflected contradictory positions and confiscatory conduct. Since the 1970s, however, these relations have regularized into a self-determination and self-governance era of mutually respectful government-to-government relations. The Choctaw Nation's 1983 Constitution, adopted and federally approved in compliance with federal court supervision, reflects this new era. It is untenable for Chairwoman Waters to ask the 116th Congress to reach back into indefensible and conflictive periods of history and impose just one portion of a treaty imposed upon the Choctaw Nation in 1866 without regard to the meandering mass of countervailing treaties, law, and policy that followed the 1866 treaty. Likewise, it would be both unseemly and unfair for Congress to take the extreme step of holding hostage housing assistance otherwise due to the Choctaw Nation in 2020 until the Choctaw Nation complies with a provision of the 1866 treaty, especially since the United States itself has wholly breached its obligations under many other provisions of the same 1866 treaty. The heavy-handed penalty in Chairwoman Waters' bill language, withholding federal housing assistance funds for underprivileged Choctaw families, is without precedent. The Choctaw Nation is not aware of any other instance in recent decades where Congress has held federal appropriations hostage, as Chairwoman Waters proposes to do, in an effort to force a sovereign Indian tribal government to violate or alter its own constitution. It would be far more prudent and appropriate for Congress to defer to the courts to resolve such disputes and claims regarding Indian treaty interpretation and legal rights. Madam Speaker, the Choctaw Nation appreciates the leadership you have shown in support of tribal self-determination and self-sufficiency over the years. Now, at this critical time in American history, the Choctaw Nation asks that you not permit the House to adopt any legislative provision that would so fundamentally destroy the self-determination authority of the Choctaw Nation. We support your efforts and those of Chairwoman Waters and many others to shape real and meaningful ways to address the systemic racism that continues to consign African Americans to economic underprivilege and discrimination long after the Emancipation Proclamation. The responsibility to address systemic racism in America should be borne by all Americans, not just the Choctaw Nation. And while Congress looks at how America might repair the theft of the value of the labor of enslaved African Americans, we ask that Congress give equivalent consideration to how American might repair the theft of land and resources stolen from Indian tribes like the Choctaw Nation. The Choctaw Nation understands more than many Americans what it is like to live today with the trauma and legacy of historical theft of freedom, labor, and property. For that reason, I am interested in joining a conversation about how the Choctaw Nation can, together with you and Chairman Waters, find ways that the federal government might make appropriate amends and grant appropriate measures of redress to African Americans as well as Native Americans. Having the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development hold back our housing funds until he interprets one of our treaties and our compliance with it as proposed by Chairman Waters is a non-starter. Sincerely, Chief Gary Batten, Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma.
Thank you, Matthew. We're going to go to Mike, and hopefully Floyd will be with us soon.
I might want to first. I was saying thank you, Clody, for having me. And the piece that I'll be reading today is from ALX Now, from Alexandria, Virginia. And it's from their news section. It's called, the title is Virginia Theological Seminary is Making Reparation Payments to Slavery Descendants. And the article was filed on June 2nd, 2021 by Vernon Miles. The Virginia Theological Seminary's VTS ongoing effort to pay $1.7 million in reparations to the descendants of those enslaved at the school was highlighted this week in the New York Times. The reparations program was launched in 2019, but the school started to issue payments to more than a dozen families in February. The checks at about $2,100 this year will come annually and have begun to flow to the descendants of those Black workers, the New York Times reported. The money has been pulled from a 1.7 million fund, which is set to grow at a rate of the seminary's large endowment. Though just 15 people have received payments so far, that number could grow by dozens as genealogists pour through the records to find living descendants. Alexandria City Council member John Chapman, who also leads a local Black History tour company, said the seminary's work is a good first step. Quote, "It's a phenomenal thing to do," end quote. Chapman said, "To do research to connect with descendants and to figure out how to best make that reparation. It's an amazing step, and I hope more organizations do the work to know their history." Georgetown University across the river has made similar plans to implement reparations for past slave ownership. Chapman also warned that organizations hoping to make progress on reparation plans may need a contingency plan should backlash erupt within their groups. VTS President and Dean, Reverend Ian S. Markham, for instance, told the New York Times that there was pushback from some donors. "It would be great to have a template, but every organization needs to look at best practices for themselves," Chapman said. "Like VTS or Georgetown, you have to fully lean into it. Every organization is going to have to commit because there are going to be factions that are opposed to it." That is the end of the article.
We do have someone that is taking a sweet time getting here, but that's okay. When he gets here, he'll read whatever. With regard to both of the pieces that you read, they're talking about how this country, specific entities, will deal with their history of enslaving African people. And as we heard in Matthew's piece, the chief never actually comes out and says that the Choctaws were responsible for enslaving people. He puts it at the feet of the United States government. And while partially that may be true, at some point, they have to acknowledge that that is a part of their history and also other tribes' history. And I just want to find out from both of you, what before recently have you heard about freedmen and African people enslaved by other than white Southerners?
So I will say in my early, self-education as a non-Black person of color, there is this myth of Black and brown solidarity that has been there, throughout tumultuous times that we don't really talk about. So then you don't hear that well-rounded history that Africans were enslaved by many peoples, not just the same people that may have enslaved us. So that is not something that is prevalent in non-Black spaces of color, unfortunately. But it is a conversation that we need to be having, because if we're portraying that everybody was just we understood because we also suffered. It was not like that. It's been very much a like, who can be the slave master instead. It became a kind of competition for, I get to be, white capitalism and things like that. I believe that if I make enough money, I will be, out of this kind of thing. But still carrying these anti-blackness with that, because that is all rooted in white supremacy. So unfortunately, it wasn't until much later that I myself learned about enslaved Africans, by indigenous peoples, indigenous tribes, and things like that. Just because it's a conversation that folks they don't want to have.
Right. And also they're not very well informed about it, with our current pushback on a more truthful education, beginning with our youth, but in reality, the entire country needs to become more educated about the history. But with this pushback, um, the current pushback, Mike, you as a teacher, how do you approach something like that, or what do you think is a reasonable way to approach something like that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because I when I think of this issue and what you're addressing, I think of it from a multifaceted perspective. One is being a college educator at Arizona State University, and the kind of, to a certain extent, the academic freedom that I have, but sometimes the institutional impediments that as you said, the politics that come into play. Along with that, I have a daughter, a 12-year-old daughter that's going to primary school. So I also, see it from that perspective as well. And I think first, to deal with her, I would agree with what Matt said, that there is that kind of dominant narrative of history, and of the history of slavery, of the history of African Americans, just the many histories that follow kind of a linear narrative, and that leave out a multiplicity of voices that are often problematic. And then, when we talk about including those voices, there often is that pushback and discomfort from other parents. At a university level, I think, to be frank with you, I think that we have done a good job in words, but we often don't do a good job in deeds and in following through on those words, so that we have many different scholarships, we start discussions, but we often, again, fall into these kind of traditional histories, these traditional narratives, and we're not as serious as I would like us to be about including a kind of multiplicity of voices, experiences, and really peeling back. Because I think one of the things, when we talk about reparations, part of, to me, reparations is the idea of uncovering and even dealing with those uncomfortable truths of, indigenous folks having slaves, and their kind of participation in that. So those are kind of my two perspectives, at least from an educational standpoint.
Okay, Phyllis, I'm going to go ahead and let Floyd read his piece, but we'll come back to our conversation. And okay, Mr. Galloway, welcome. Let's unmute you. You're muted. You need to unmute yourself, buddy. Okay, thank you. So if you will go ahead and read your selection, and then we'll come back for more conversation.
Okay. Hopefully I can come through pretty clearly. I'm reading from the book American Slavery, 1619-1877 by Peter Kolchin. For centuries, a wide range of social thinkers had seen the institution as fully compatible with human progress and felicity. Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, and John Locke differed from one another in many ways, but the three proponents, respectively, of reasons, Christian theology, and liberty agreed in finding slavery an acceptable part of social order. In the 17th and early 18th centuries, only a handful of thinkers in British colonies dare challenge this long-standing consensus. The most notably, the most early, the most notable early criticism of slavery came from the pen of Massachusetts Judge Samuel Sewall, whose cautious pamphlet, The Selling of Joseph, 1700, elicited an immediate and forceful rebuttal. A brief and candid answer from merchant politician John Safin. This was, however, an isolated exchange that made little impression upon contemporaries, few of whom bothered either to defend or to attack slavery. Largely taken for granted, the institution was simply not much of an issue for white colonists. Where slavery did compel attention, was it was almost always over pragmatic considerations involving the utility of particular policies, not the morality of human bondage. The first substantial movement in defense of slavery occurred in newly settled Georgia, where for a variety of practical reasons, chief of which was a concern that the Spanish in Florida would incite slave revolt among their neighbors up to the north. An act of 1735 barred slaves from the colony. Proponents of slavery, who stressed the necessity of black labor for the prosperity of the semi-tropical colony, carried the day by 1750, when the prohibition was lifted. Other colonists, however, worried about the threat to security posed by too many slaves. As planter William Byrd II noted in 1736, in praising Georgia's prohibition on slavery, too many slaves produced the necessity of from numbers make them insolent, and their base tempers required to be rid with a tort rein, or they will be apt to throw their rider, lamenting that this is terrible to a good-natured man. Byrd opinion that the further importation of them in our colonies should be prohibited, lest they prove as troublesome and dangerous everywhere as they have been lately in Jamaica. Precisely such fears, supplemented by the desires to raise money, prompted several colonies to pass import duties on slaves. Beginning in 1690s, the Revolutionary era, slavery for the first time became a serious social issue. Relatively few people called for this immediate abolition, but many, including some slave owners, expressed real concern over the morality as well as to its utility. This questioning of slavery, even when it did not lead to clear-cut support of universal emancipation, represented a significant departure from the general neglect of the subject that had previously prevailed. The challenge to an established institution in turn elicited vigorous protests from those convinced that their interests and the social fabric in general were being recklessly threatened. A variety of factors converged beginning in the third quarter of the 18th century and accelerating during the Revolutionary War to produce this development. Perhaps most basic was the fundamental shift that occurred in the middle decades of the 18th century under the influence of Enlightenment thought that flourished among Western European and American intellectuals in the attitudes toward cruelty, rights, fair play, and the tolerance of differences. In short, how human beings should treat one another. Because of this pervasive shift, these years must be regarded as a kind of watershed separating the modern from the pre-modern eras. 17th century settlers in the colonies, and usually their children as well, lived in a world that took for granted stocks and tongue bearings, religious prescriptions, fear of witches, and savage repression of the lower orders. The founding fathers who led the American Revolution spoke instead of natural rights, political liberty, freedom of religion, equality before the law. In this new intellectual climate, the treatment and even the ownership of slaves became a pertinent subject. Especially significant were changing notions of what constituted legitimate treatment of those who were poor, weak, or different. A new concern as humane treatment symbolized by the structure in the Eighth Amendment to the United States Constitution against, quote, cruel and unusual punishment, end quote, led to a sharp decrease in the use of corporal punishment on free adults. Although this although this decrease did not extend to slaves or children, heightened attention to the mistreatment of slaves was evident both among outsiders shocked by the barbarities they witnessed and among resident masters concerned with lives of their people. This opposition to the physical mistreatment of slaves did not necessarily lead to the opposition of slavery itself. Indeed, in the antebellum years, accentuating the humane treatment of slaves became a prime concern of the peculiar institution's defenders, who believed that the softening slavery they would render it more secure. Still, attention to the treatment was necessary first step in the overall challenge to slavery because it involved questioning the established practices. Once began, it was not always clear where such questioning would stop. Take South Carolina planter and merchant Henry Lawrence, whose letters during the 1740s and 1750s were filled with straightforward business comments on buying and selling Africans. Quote, please to observe the prime people turn to best account here, end quote. He wrote his supplier in 1757 that the males, quote, the males are preferable to females, and that Calabars are not at all light with us when they are above the age of 18. Gambians or Gold Coast are preferred to others. Windward coast next to them. By 1763, however, expressing qualms that were increasingly prevalent among others of his generation, Lawrence had decided that he would rather not pursue African trade, although he did not immediately cease participating in it. Later in the year, he went further still, agreeing with the Moravian missionaries who had written to him complaining that children whose parents owned slaves grew up lazy. Lawrence responded that he wished quote, he wished that our economy and government differed from the present system, but alas, since our Constitution is as it is, what can individuals do? End quote. Within a few years, in action highly atypical of whites in labor-hungry South Carolina, Lawrence had moved beyond this cautious disquiet over slavery and decided that individuals could, in fact, make a difference. In 1779, he and his son John, both active patriots, promoted an unusual and ultimately unsuccessfully scheme to enroll in the Revolutionary Army 3,000 slaves who would be freed at the end of the war. Among the intellectuals, a spreading belief in human mobility sparked question about the grounds of enslaving Africans. In the 17th century, English thinkers on both sides of the Atlantic had been struck by what they considered the savagery of Africans. And in the first half of the 18th century, many white Americans had come to see blacks as innately deprived, fit only for slavery. In the second half of the 18th century, however, growing awareness of cultural diversity of peoples, accompanied by intense interest in the question of human nature, spawned new thinking on the question of black depravity. Perhaps it was their slave status that created slave-like behavior rather than the behavior that justified the status. If so, blacks removed from slavery would no longer act like slaves. Because discovery of talented blacks could confirm the environmentalist hypothesis, poet Phyllis Wheatley and mathematician Benjamin Banneker received considerable attention during the late 18th century. Even Thomas Jefferson, who had more doubts than many of his contemporaries about the intellectual potential of blacks, who dismissed Wheatley as a mediocre poet, was impressed by Benjamin Banneker. Quote, I am happy to be able to inform you that we have now in the United States a Negro who is very respectable mathematician, end quote. The Virginian wrote the Marcus de Consonance in 1791. Quote, I shall be delighted to see these instances of moral eminence so multiplied as to prove that the want of talents observed in them is merely the effect of their degraded condition and not proceeding from any difference in the structure of the parts on which intellect depends, end quote. The spread of capitalism and the new dismissal science of economics that it spawned contributed significantly to the questioning of slavery. Slavery lacked a basic ingredient of capitalism, the free hire of labor through mutual agreement and of consenting parties, substituting the physical coercion of the lash for the economic coercion of the marketplace. Slavery did violence to the central values implicit in the capitalist relationships. While most late 18th century merchants only dimly perceived or did not perceive at all the conflict between slavery and capitalist worldview, the logic of belief in free trade and the freedom of individual to succeed or to fail on the basis of one's own efforts exonerably led to challenges to slavery's legitimacy. Early political economists including Adam Smith, whose book, The Wealth of Nations, 1776, remained for decades the most influential justification of the principles of underlying capitalism. Believed that slavery, by preventing the free buying and selling of labor power, and by eliminating possibilities of self-improvement, that was the main incentive to productive labor, violated central economic laws, like government regulations of wages, prices, and interest rates. Slavery constituted an artificial restraint of trade. The view that slavery was immoral because it violated fundamental economic law, which 18th century thinkers almost invariably elevated to either natural or divine law, was especially prevalent among Quakers, who in both Britain and America took the lead first in opposing slavery and then in organizing abolitionist groups to combat it. A small sect dominated by hard-working businessmen, distinguished by their mercantile wealth, and above all by their entrepreneurial leadership. Quakers rejected religious authority in favor of inner light that would guide each individual to religion and morality. By the 1760s, most had come to view slavery as unethical. To Quakers, the slave represented a diametric opposition of the dependable, orderly, and industrious worker that they strove to create. A prominent Quaker abolitionist, John Woolman, put it, explaining his response in 1757 to a Virginian who insisted that blacks were too slothful to be free. Quote, I replied that free men whose minds are properly on their business found a satisfaction in improving, cultivating, and providing for their families. But Negroes laboring to support others who claimed them as their property and expecting nothing but slavery during life had not the like inducement to be industrious, end quote. Among Quakers, more than among any other group, environmentalism combined with the capitalist worldview and religion sensibilities to produce a principal opposition in slavery. More widespread was the related view that slavery was inefficient, socially degrading to society at large. The germs of the free labor, quote unquote, critique of labor that would be fully developed in antebellum years was already present in diverse strains of by the middle and 18th century. Planters are as different as William Byrd II and Thomas Jefferson joined outside observers in worrying that growing up with slaves made white Southerners lazy, haughty, and overbearing. Others feared that white children would absorb the brutish behavior of blacks who surrounded them and become degraded themselves. But it was the harmful economic impact of slavery that seemed most obvious to of all. Planters had long lamented what they considered the slovenly work habits of slaves, who needed to be coaxed and chided, bribed, and beaten to engage in their everyday labor. And in time with Peak, they had wondered aloud whether plantation management was worth the effort. During the second half of the 18th century, Such concern was exacerbated in the upper South by the crisis of tobacco in the tobacco economy. Economic hardships proved especially conducive in questioning established relations, including slavery. Indeed, many outside observers and some Southerners as well blame slavery itself for the economic hardship. New Jersey born minister in training, Philip Fritham, who spent 1773 through 1774 in Virginia tutoring the children on Robert Carter III's Nomi Hall plantation, was no abolitionist, but he was convinced that slavery degraded the manners, morals, and work habits of whites and blacks alike. When he broached the subject of, quote, Negroes in Virginia, end quote, with Carter's wife, whom he greatly admired, he was pleased to find that she, quote, she esteems their value as no higher rate than I do, end quote. They agreed that if the slaves were sold, the money loaned out, and the land allowed to lie uncultivated, the bare interest of the price of the Negroes would be much greater yearly income than what is now received from their work in the lands, end quote. Fifth conclusion was pointed, quote, how much greater than must be the value of the estate here if these poor enslaved Africans were all in their native desired country and in their room industrious tenants, who being born in freedom and by laudable care would not only enrich their landlords, but would raise a hardy offspring to be the strength and the honor of the colony, end quote. New religious developments provided a final source of anti-slavery thought. It is not always easy to isolate religious from other from other motivation in the second half of the 18th century because people so commonly phrased other sentiments in religious terms. A thin line, for example, frequently separated economic law from natural law and or divine law in the rhetoric of the time. Nevertheless, it is clear that the religious revivals that began with the Great Awakening in the 1740s and spread through much of the South in the 1770s and the 1780s had a major impact on thinking about slavery. Not only did evangelical Christians show a new, lost the light, a new interest in the souls of slaves. Oh, I'm coming back. New interest in the souls. I lost my place. A thin line separating economic law from natural law. Nevertheless, it is clear that the religious revivals that began the Great Awakening in the 1740s and spread through much of the South in the 1770s and the 1780s had a major impact of thinking about slavery. Not only did evangelical Christians show a new interest in the souls of slaves, but they also often displayed real anguish about slaves itself, especially in the upper South. Methodists and Baptists who stressed humility, submission, and the equality of all souls before God seemed ready during the last quarter of the 18th century to follow the Quakers into anti-slavery agitation. Before the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, then slavery had emerged for the first time as a major issue. Although a diverse strain of thought had converged to produce this development, they were, in a broad sense, related to each other. On both sides of the Atlantic, the third quarter of the 18th century saw a remarkable growth of intellectual activity among educated gentlemen, and a much smaller number of ladies convinced that they represented the dawn of a bright new era. The gentlemen thought, wrote, and exchanged information about the extraordinary range of subjects, from the orbiting of planets and the tax, taxonomy of animal species to human nature and ideal forms of government, maintaining that the key to progress lay in reason. They questioned established beliefs such as the divinity of Christ, established institutions such as monarchy, hereditary privilege. It is hardly surprising that these modern Renaissance thinkers also question slavery. In America, these were also men who led the movement of for independence and had often been referred to as founding fathers. Usually members of the colonial elite, they included lawyers such as John Adams, a self-educated artisan intellectuals as Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine. In the South, however, there were most often wealthy planters. An extraordinary generation of planter politicians. Historian Clement Eaton termed it, quote, great generation, end quote, led the American states to independence, created new government, and dominated the government during its early years. Although they ranged from Maryland to Georgia, they were most concentrated in Virginia. One thinks immediately of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Patrick Henry, all among the largest slave owners of their day, but could easily add others such as George Mason, Edmund Randolph, although these leaders were part of an international community of intellectual statesmen that even before the outbreak of the American Revolution had come to challenge the legitimacy of slavery. The revolution will soon lead them to push their challenge substantially further. That's it.
Okay, so I'm first of all just going to say that Floyd has been with me since the very first Emancipation Marathon, which may have been a bit ill thought out, but we were much younger at the time. The very first went on for 24 hours of continuous reading, and our studios were in what is now the Valley Bar. So we could be open as long as we wanted. And not having a place as artists to really keep our doors open. Not that I want to go back to 24 hours, but I do like to keep events and conversations going. And it's having a focus like this once a year, maybe in other people's vision, but this is my focus all the time. I am always reading and thinking about these things. And so when I hear something on the news that Pat Robertson has said, it takes me back to that article. And if I can, now I don't know what's going on with Floyd, but if I can pose a few more questions in what we heard, because various groups use God as justification for aberrant behavior. And eventually, possibly, someone will break away from those groups. But obviously, going back to how they're teaching and not wanting to teach, we can see that there's going to be some pushback in religious organizations and in schools that have a religious um, um, bent. And so even though parents are paying tuition and these institutions are esteemed as giving the best education, and for parents to take their children out, that might be a mistake, okay, because they could wind up taking them somewhere just as ill-informed. And so I'm a proponent of independent groups, independent education. And I'd like to get your feelings on those things. And I'm going to start with Floyd. Oh, he's frozen. Okay. So, Matt, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Clotty. As I referenced earlier, my own self-education, I was expelled from South Mountain High School. I was pushed out, as many Black and brown boys were post Columbine, my self-education came pretty early. I was lucky enough to stumble upon. Well, this was the early 2000s, so. Roosevelt had a lot of art galleries, a lot of interesting stuff going on there, and Thought Crime Art Gallery had an anarchist library. So I was able to read history books that were more well-rounded and honest. Historians and being an archaeologist, to me, they're like mechanics. Like there's no like good or bad. You're either honest or you're a terrible person. I think it came early for me. I also, being Chicano, came up Catholic, but more of a sentimentally Catholic. But, there is that same kind of, there are things that you don't broach, subjects you don't broach, you don't talk about. And, folks definitely don't want to hear that something that they held dear is either incorrect or was given to them by a different culture, or that they had stolen it completely from somewhere else. So the need for self-education and thinking critically and searching outside of these compartmentalized, everybody wants to be the hero in their story. They might find out that their lineage is not at all that. But that's history, and if we ignore that, there's no way that we can move forward and work for a better future or a better present. Some of these we talk about these traumas as if they're over. There are new traumas being committed, new acts, heinous acts every day. Slavery continues on in many other methods through redlining, segregation, resegregation, and then rebranded as something new and different. And we have to have these honest conversations with ourselves and search outside of what we've known all, or we thought we knew.
Exactly. And go ahead, Michael. You can add your thoughts onto that.
Yeah, I would just, at the beginning, I would add on a little bit to what Matt said. I think he's 100% correct. I think that what the last, 5 years have shown us is that with President Trump in office, it allowed a kind of licensing to a lot of what had remained in terms of racism and white supremacy, and those attitudes below the surface, it had kind of given license to the reemergence of of these ideologies, of actions, of all of the things that Matt had kind of eloquently highlighted. So I think he's exactly right. It's not it's something that is always relevant. As a white cis male, my education, I primarily, for my primary and secondary education, went to Catholic school as well. And that followed a pretty traditional trajectory, as you would expect, in terms of what that meant for my education. It meant the kind of dominant history, both religious history, U.S. history, world history, et cetera, et cetera. So I found that, and that's why I liked also what Matt said about self-education. Much of my education outside of that institutionalized education came from both self-education, but also a lot of my learning came from social, what I like to think of as social education. It was different people I worked with, different communities I came into contact with, different communities that my mother and my father worked with, and having the chance to sit down with those communities, go to celebrations, eat, play music with them, all of those type of things. And it was through many of those events where people would, turn me on to something or say, you should look at this. Or, even if it was something that I may have been speaking on or talking about, subtly corrected me and pointed me in a different direction. So I think that, highlighting that the role of I think, we often rely too much on institutional education and not enough on self-education and social education, the education that comes through the various communities that we're all part of, the histories that flow through the communities that we're all part of. And there was a quote in the article I read, and I loved what he had said, and it was from the Alexandria City Councilman John Chapman. He said, to do the research to connect with descendants and to figure out how to best make that reparation, it's an amazing step, and I hope more organizations do the work to know their history. And I think that that's what, again, when I think of reparations, when I think of it writ large, that's what I think of. It's the work to know, but also expose, to converse, to be uncomfortable with, to just know that history, to embrace that history for, as Matt said, all of the good and all of the bad. That's part of it. I might have lost.
Answer my door. Actually, that's a great answer. However, it's such a daunting task because so many of our ancestors have been lost. And in order to receive, ideally, receive reparations, one must go through these steps of proving who we are. And many of us, except for very immediate history, we're lost. Our language is lost, our ancestors are lost. And when I began the Emancipation Marathon and a lot of my other work, it was to honor my ancestors. So I'm frequently finding out things, but I am also consistently running into brick walls. And is that because, as in massacres, is that because they were murdered? Is that because perhaps they were light complected and they decided to pass? So very often it's not going to be an equitable approach to reparations. A lot of people will get left out. So there needs to be an approach that will apply to the majority of African Americans. And as we were hearing earlier, there are all of these varying, historically have been varying opinions about Black intelligence and attitude. There was a term called drapetomania, where they were just saying that Black people were just lazy and it affected their minds, and they just wouldn't get out and do their work, and so that was drapetomania. And head size and all of these things that went into IQ that we know is really a false standard. And much of that leads our youth to be judged the minute they set their foot in the classroom. Who didn't want to be cool when they were a kid? And so they're talking certain ways, they're walking certain ways, and subliminally, perhaps, their teachers are making these unfair assessments that have been handed down to them through those types of things. And part of the struggle, obviously, is that so many people are incarcerated because at an early age, those assessments were made, or so many people are murdered. And I'm going to just let you guys give me a little bit of input on that. I know that for young men, macho is the thing. You have to assert yourself. And if somebody looks at you a certain way, you got to be hard and all that stuff. But that could be so misinterpreted. Go ahead, Mike.
Man, there's a lot to say in regards to that. I think that you are spot on in terms of, well, first let me say in terms of the classroom, I think all the way from kindergarten through college, the way that we think of African Americans, Black and brown people in general, is shaped by all of the kind of fabric of racism that's really tied into our culture, so that often those assumptions that we make they're almost just they're narratives that we've internalized so much, and that often surround us, that I think you have to do, again, it comes back to, you have to do real work in order to kind of dismantle those things. And I think that what's important to see in that is it's not so much, it is individual actions, but it's also a larger systemic kind of work and actions where there has to be change in order to move away from those judgments. Or we've seen there's been multiple studies in terms of disciplinary actions in both primary and secondary education, and the way that it is shaped and aimed primarily at Black and brown students, and disproportionate punishments. That all the way to what is being taught, the histories that are being taught, the economic systems that are being taught, what's privileged, all of those things are wrapped up in kind of shaping the experience, I think. And not only that, the educational opportunities of those students. So I think, yeah, that's a highly problematic kind of structure that we've only started in some communities to address. And again, as we're seeing right now, when at a governmental level and at local school levels, there's consistent pushback. So it's a difficult thing for sure.
I think that there's a lot to the question, and I want to start with, racism in the U.S. Was founded on imperialism and genocide of Black peoples and indigenous peoples, and that comes in many different ways. And I think to speak to the own kind of hypocrisy of white supremacy to label, Black peoples as lazy or dumb, but still reliant on their labor, on their contributions. White supremacy is really a Rube Goldberg machine that has all these moving parts that just go out of the way to attack Black people in the U.S. And one of those ways is to vilify folks, and we see a lot of that, especially in Phoenix. I refer to it as disruptive joy. White people hate, right, and also non-Black people of color hate when Black people are, when they laugh too loud, or when they hear them talking. They want all these things from you, but they don't want to see or hear you. I want your art, but I don't want the artist. All of these things. But also within the schools, I mentioned I was pushed out of South. A major reason was, these questions in my history classes and questions of teachers that would say like, oh, I've taught here for 20 years. Me as a person of color in that school, that worried me. It's like, oh, okay, so were you the one that used to beat my neighbor in the school? Or, when you heard kids speaking Spanish, did you hit them with a ruler? Or did you just do nothing when you saw that happen? So I think in the schools, like, there is no space for, at the very least, just those questions, especially when teachers are overwhelmingly white. We don't see a lot of Black teachers. We definitely don't see a lot of Black male teachers. And they are quick. They carry that with them. They don't want to hear students. They don't want to be questioned by students. That they are carrying this legacy of, I feel that they are less than, that they are dumb, that they are rude, or things like that. And these teachers and systems, which are still prevalent, and will continue to be prevalent if we don't address them. Which, if I can be candid, which I can't be candid, we're live. Red for Ed doesn't address systemic racism, and that is alarming to me. And part of me is like, hey, no money for racist teachers. Are you crazy? We need to address these things as well. We still have Black and brown students, primarily Black and brown, boys and girls that are being pushed out of schools at alarming rates. And even if they're not pushed out or expelled or go into the, prison pipeline, they're still, we're going to send you to the office. We're going to make you sit outside of class. We're taking as much away from you as we possibly can. So maybe you won't be the statistic that ends up in prison, but I'm going to make sure that you miss lessons, that you don't get to socialize with other students, that other students look at you and start to carry what I carry with me. And that's that I don't feel that you're worth being in this classroom. So that is a legacy that lives on and will continue to do so until we really, start holding folks accountable. We have a lot of school boards that are filled with racist board members. And it's not just the crazy people that show up to the board meetings, it's the people that are sitting up there getting yelled at too. So.
Absolutely. And going back to the essence of what it means to be a slave, I don't think that people really comprehend that. And if I'm just going to read a quote from Frederick Douglass. He had struck down my personality, had subjected me to his will, made property of my body and soul, reduced me to chattel. We do not hear the word chattel often enough in its proper context. And in other words, someone had taken away his humanity. And humanity, in my opinion, is something that can be siphoned off in degrees. It's very easy to um, do some of the things that you said, create obstacles, create barriers. And it's also very easy to reinforce stigma. And Black people, I don't care where you come from in this world, we all have a stigma attached to us by virtue of the fact that Africa is our motherland. There is a huge stigma um, associated with not just our intelligence and our morals, but our violent natures. And that's something that you see children punished for. Um, I remember when we were in grammar school, Catholic school, where my brother would be frequently in trouble for not letting other kids beat him up or walk all over him, or he didn't start it, but it was going to stop. And so that is something that is this huge stigma is something that is so rarely talked about. And with the new movie In the Heights, we're hearing more and more about colorism, but we're not really hearing the essential facet of stigma. In other words, I'm a little old lady, so little old white lady, why are you afraid of me? Or why are you angry with me? Why are you making assumptions about me? And that is a huge part of what I try to do with these engagements, if you will. And, I have to say that the Emancipation Marathon has brought me a wonderful community, though, of people that, I call somebody up and I say, hey, I've got a crazy idea. And they're like, okay, I'm in. It's like you haven't even heard it yet. And so it's brought me this wonderful community. And that's the thing that keeps my optimism going, is that I know there are people that agree with me. Maybe they never thought of these things in exactly the same way I have, but my brother always says artists have work to do, and that is my community. And in this coming season, okay, beginning in the fall, I will be calling on every artist I know to do something about this racism, because we simply cannot afford to let it manifest at its current level, because it's growing. We know it's growing. We hear so much about Black reluctance to get vaccinated, and a lot of it has to do with stigma, and a lot of it is perpetrated by those individuals that are taking old news clippings and just using the same language over and over and over again. And so some of the things that obviously, next year there'll be another marathon, but this week, so that everybody knows, we will be doing something focused on American chattel slavery all week, all week long. I've got videos that the technology gods have have been, just wreaking havoc with me all week, trying to download these videos from different parts of the country and so forth. But we'll have videos, we'll have more discussions, but we'll also have mini concerts, because I really do believe that art is what's going to help us through this. And if either of you have something that you would like to add to that, please feel free, because we've got about 15 minutes and then we'll wrap it up.
Well, I'll just say briefly that I think you are 100% right in talking about art, and what you had said reminded me of a quote from Chinua Achebe, where he talks about the importance of a balance of stories, having a balance of stories, and I think that that representation, that balance of stories, is so important in kind of highlighting and speaking to really everything that we've talked about to this afternoon. So I think that, to me, uh, that's vital, and that those stories and those representations come from a variety of different communities, and to be honest, uh, a lot of times, from where I'm coming from, I need to just check myself and listen, I think it's important too, as depending on the community that we're part of or the communities that we're part of, sometimes it's important to let others lead, to let others speak, their truth, to let others kind of teach us about history, and the significance of what they've gone through. So I think that those are important. All of what you have done, Clody, and all the work that you continue to do is so important, and that's why I'm always humbled to kind of be part of it, even in a participatory way. I'm always humbled to be a part of it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks again, Cloti, for having me. It's always a pleasure to have a conversation with you, and support what you do. I do want to bring it back to what you mentioned, the language that we use when talking about enslaved peoples, because normally we don't hear that. We don't hear that. We don't hear chattel slavery either. But we treat the word slave as if it was an identity, which kind of like validates it and makes it okay, but it was not. These are enslaved peoples. These were people that were stolen from land that they had ties to, and then those ties were erased. And I think it's important, especially now, if we acknowledge that slavery did not end. It changed. It was rebranded. It became our justice system. It helps us to see the bigger picture, that these things still continue on. When we label folks just felons, they are people that have been taken away from their families, from the land that they have ties to, and we ruin their lives, essentially. And we also see that there's disparate treatment within those systems that still favor white people. So I think the language that we use is really important, in addition to just telling a more complete history of the atrocities and the bad actors that were there, regardless of how much that is uncomfortable for us. But what is us being uncomfortable during a conversation when we're talking about genocide, a whole cultures being lost and forgotten, not only just forgotten, but erased in a way to where folks cannot retrace those steps. It has been made impossible to. So I think, using the appropriate language that paints the bigger picture. Some people don't like, that direct language, because that's what it really is. You're just being direct and honest about it. Because it hurts feelings, but we're not prioritizing white comfort when we're trying to liberate Black peoples now, since they have not been still in this country.
And these are all excellent points. The work that we'll be doing in the future, I know that I mentioned this previously, because there's so much pushback in schools. I believe in being independent. I believe in having community engagements. I believe in actually crafting a curriculum that will not just be edifying, but be something that will stimulate the intellectual curiosity, and then people, not just children, but other people will come to that intellectual um, point that you came to, Matthew, when you were kicked out of South Mountain. You started to self educate. All of us have got to get to that point where it's a part of who we are. I've got to look up this thing, I've got to study that, I've got to compare this. And we need to do more independently. And that is what I'm trying to do. I do get asked to come to schools, and when they want to hear what I'm going to talk about, they're like, could you talk about Martin Luther King? Well, yeah, I could do that. I could do that, but aren't you doing that already? So, and I try to show where their students might have a sense of belonging, whether it's in music, whether it is in tone, just sound, drumming, singing, what have you. There is so much that is lost. I ask young people if they know where their grandparents were born. Very often they don't. And so, for many of the reasons that we've talked about, we've got this generational abyss, and we are getting further and further and further away from knowing who we are. So, I really do thank you both for um, just participating, being interested, being just really great guys. And so I'm going to buy you both a beer when we get together. Okay. All right. And if there are any events that you would like to mention, Matthew, I would like you to say a little bit about the CRE, because that's very well worth knowing about.
Yeah, thank you, Cloti. Yeah, the Community Resource Exchange is held every Saturday from 8 to 10 at Heritage Square. The CRE is a mutual aid effort that provides folks that have been impacted by the pandemic. We've been doing this for about 1.5 years now. Pandemic's still going. But we've been able to redistribute items that have been pulled directly from community members, directly from our neighbors, and we redistribute them over at Heritage Square. So it is an effort to not only provide collective care, but also reduce an oppressive state's power to do harm to its residents. So it's neighbors helping neighbors, building community, and taking care of each other.
And one thing I like about it is that it is not dependent on faith-based something, because a lot of people are reluctant to go into a faith-based environment for whatever their reason may be. And these are just open and giving people that supply quality goods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the community has a lot of power. I believe talking to your neighbor is one of the most radical things that you can do, because then you can figure out how you can help each other without, the powers that be. And the church is one of those, or religious institutions. From where we stand, we believe that no human is disposable. That's a pretty standard tenet when it comes to abolition work. So there are no conditions, there are no metrics or barriers that you have to meet. There's nobody that is more or less deserving of food than another. And we don't take those items away. They're pulled by community, they're for community. So yeah, and we do get quality stuff because there are good people out there. And I think, that's one thing to remember too. There is a community out there for you. You just have to find it, or build it yourself. But it's there. So yeah, we do have quality items. We do we work to get culturally specific items, whether that's hair care, whether that's food, because also when you go to other distributions, it may be produce that you've never seen before. It may be, like, what is quinoa? It's hard to describe that to people. So yeah, that's one thing that we do at Heritage Square is outreach for our immediate community, and we're working on expanding that out more so we can be closer to folks that may have to travel for certain things, and we want to put these in their neighborhoods, or maybe even help them to create these systems within their neighborhoods.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much. And Mike, if there's something that you want people to know about?
Yeah, my counterpart Leah Marche, who's a poet, and myself have a organization called We Jazz June, and as part of that, we do a series called Jazz Meets Poetry. So we're going to be working with PBS in July to do some recordings that are going to be produced, I believe, for the fall that features that show, and then we will be starting that series back up at the Nash in Phoenix in this coming fall. We're starting to kind of line up shows, so I don't have anything definitively I can give you, but I can tell you from our discussions, it'll be fairly varied in kind of its makeup. So really that's the main thing coming up, and beyond that, I just want to say too, really honored to share this space with Matt, and hearing a little bit about him and his history and his ideas. So hopefully, we can get together at some point as well. And also, again, thanks, Clody, for allowing me to share this space and contribute some small way.
Absolutely. And if anyone wants to get in touch with me, I am a resident at the Phoenix Center for the Arts. So don't hesitate to send whatever it is that you want us to know about, because if we don't know about it, we can't help you with it, we can't participate, we can't appreciate it, and that's what we're here trying to do.
Clotty, do you mind if I plug one more thing?
Oh, please do.
This is kind of a plug, kind of a little bit of shade. So HR 40, Radim Robinson is working really hard to get HR 40 co-sponsored by some of our local progressive electeds, and they are ignoring him. Ruben Gallego literally ran away from Radim, who is not only an elected official here, but one of his constituents. So I think paying attention to not only the Black leaders that are down here doing work that benefits all of us, but also looking at our elected progressives to see who is in solidarity with folks right now. This is something that we have a problem with here in Phoenix, and this is something that folks need to be held accountable for.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because actually on Thursday we'll be talking about HR 40.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. So I am very glad that you brought that up. And we also, I am interested in creating a resource database for people here in Phoenix that maybe have a situation and they have no idea who to call. Mm-hmm. If you need a lawyer, who are you going to call? If you need a bonds person, if you are a contractor, if who are you going to call that's not either going to brush you off or take advantage? And there's so many scammers in the world that we really do need to start filtering deep into this stuff. So, fellas, Mike, I'm going to have to get you to give me a little close and opening drumming eventually.
Definitely.
Okay. Because, if it's got a beat, I'm all about it.
I'm ready.
Okay. All right. Well, fellas, I thank you so much. And I always enjoy talking to both of you. And I look forward to getting together again soon.
Thank you, Clotie.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.